interview with Sloan Wilson, a scientist and ecologist known for applying evolutionary thinking far beyond biology to questions of culture, cooperation, religion, and public life. He's the author of Darwin's Cathedral and Evolution for Everyone, and he discusses how his work through the Evolution Institute and Pro-Social World tries to turn these ideas into real-world change. You can read more about Sloan Wilson on our website, 6degrees.blog, or our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy the interview. You grew up in a household that valued both science and the humanities. How did that background shape your way of thinking and lead you to a career that connects evolution with culture, religion, and policy?
So my dad was a very famous novelist back in the day. His name was Sloan Wilson, and he wrote two books that were big blockbusters, resulted in movies and things like that. One was called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and the other was called The Summer Place. And so I grew up in the shadow of my famous dad, and of course writing, so that set a high standard for writing. And in some ways I was attracted to that, but in other ways I really needed to do something different from him. And I always loved nature. That's the second thing that I tell people about myself, is I always loved nature. And I had a chance to indulge in it in where we grew up, especially in our summers. And so that meant I became a scientist and also an ecologist, not a lab scientist, but a scientist who studies nature outdoors. And so those are the two sides of me. There's a kind of a novelistic side, and then there's a scientific, and there was very little science in my family. So I was departing from the family tradition by becoming a scientist.
That's great. Where did you grow up?
I grew up on the East Coast, and my family lived in suburbs around New York City, but I don't remember them very well at all. We moved a lot, but we spent summers in the Adirondacks, which is a wilderness area of New York State, on a beautiful, beautiful lake called Lake George. And so I had the most enchanted childhood. It was just so much nature and lakes and mountains and fishing and swimming and
Wow.
and all of that kind of stuff. Just everything that a boy could want.
Yeah, that's great. It must have been amazing. And your background looks so nice too right now. So
Yeah, I duplicated it. I live in the country now, so I mean, my whole persona was molded by that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So the next question is, when most biologists focused on genes, what made you start thinking about natural selection at the group level, and how did you build the case that this view still fits population genetics?
So a little more background is needed for this. Um, so when I became a scientist, we're talking about the late 60s and the early 70s now. This was at a time when Darwin's theory of evolution was really starting to be explain everything. There's a famous statement, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. The idea that Darwin's theory is so general that it can help you ask any question about any species. And so that awareness was just kind of spreading when I became a student. And it's almost like I was present during the early days of rock and roll. I mean, it was the beginning of something really big. And but it was also very gene centric, and so everything boiled down to some genes evolving over other genes, and so the term selfish genes is part of that era, as if everything that evolves has to be seen as some form of individual selfishness. And even though my folks were not religious, they were very moral, and they would just do unto others, and so it offended my sense of morality to think that morality, altruism, do unto others, um, couldn't be explained at face value from an evolutionary perspective. And the theory that can explain that is called group selection, which basically shows that not only is there competition between individuals within groups, and that tends to favor forms of selfishness, but there's also competition among groups, and that tends to favor cooperation. So selfishness beats altruism within groups, cooperative groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. So I was a champion of group selection at a time when it was very widely rejected
Hmm.
by most evolutionary biologists.
Hmm. And so this altruism does survive competition.
That's right. Altruism is a very adaptive, and but you can only explain it at the group level because altruism is indeed vulnerable. I think we all know this as human beings. You know it, I know it. That
Hmm.
when you extend yourself to other people, you're you're vulnerable to exploitation and free riding and
Hmm.
so there's kind of altruism starts out with one strike against it, but thankfully, when groups of altruists who are all benefiting each other compete against other group, then there is your strong factor in favor of its evolution. So it's actually very simple. I mean, you think you don't need fancy equations in order to understand the basic logic.
Hmm. Yeah. In Darwin's Cathedral, you treated religions as product of evolution. What led you to that idea, and how does it help explain both the cooperation inside religious groups and the differences between traditions?
So I've already said that when I was a grad student, then evolution was proving itself for biology, but it had not yet expanded to include all aspects of humanity, basically. So that was like a second stage where the very same theory that enabled me to study any non-human creature could also study our own species
Hmm.
was something that took place over the ensuing decades that I was a part of it. And for someone who's studying altruism, of course, religion is a natural hunch,
Hmm.
natural a choice. And
Hmm.
there was one study in particular, which I think serves as a good example of this, a particular religion called the Hutterites, which is a very communal religion. It originated in Europe, and then they migrated to North America, and they're most common in Canada. And so it's a very communal society. They live in colonies. And colonies, when they grow, they split, just like a beehive splits. These
Hmm.
colonies split, but it's always more of a hardship to to found a new colony than to stay in the old one. And so you can imagine that there could be a lot of conflict associated with who goes, who stays.
Hmm.
Um, and so the custom that they evolved was they divide the community up into two lists
Hmm.
that are balanced with respect to skill and age and all of that. And
Hmm.
then on the night before the split, everybody packs their bags and then they draw out of the list by lottery. And then that's the one that goes.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you're a biology major, Anya, but this is just like the rules of meiosis. When organisms reproduce and their chromosomes line up in two lists, and so this is such an amazing example of how a human culture was actually emulating something very biological and solving the conflicts because now it's just chance. It's not, I mean, it's such a great convention. A little bit like drawing straws is another example that
Hmm.
if there's something dangerous or costly that needs to be done by a single individual,
Hmm.
if you draw straws, then that's fair because you've randomized the chance that anybody can pick the short straw. So see, these are some of the conventions, basically cultural conventions that religions and many other groups um, have evolved to make them very cooperative. So that's how I started studying religion.
Hmm. Actually, I just want to add this in because you were talking about biology. I am okay. There, I unpaused it. I am do plan on applying to do a bio major in college, and I'm interested in medicine. So
Okay.
yeah, I just wanted to let you know because you were talking.
Oh, good. No, so medicine, of course, along with everything else,
Yeah.
needs to be studied, of course, from an evolutionary
Mm-hmm.
um, perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And just on that point, and this just shows you this explanatory scope. So we just talked about religion. Let's talk about cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And if we talk about cancer, what is it? Well, it's actually evolution taking place within our bodies, between our cells within our bodies. And a cancer cell, what does it do? It proliferates faster than the normal cells. So
Mhm.
in a sense, it's adaptive. In a weird sense, it's adaptive, even though, of course, the whole organism might die as a result. So when we talk about the advantage of selfishness within groups, basically, and we're thinking of social groups and selfish individuals, you can frame shift that downward so that the organism is the group and the cells are the individuals, and then selfishness, cancer can be seen as a form of selfishness. And there's a wonderful book on this topic by Athena Actipus, someone you might think of working with. She works in Arizona, titled "The Cheating Cell," which is about cancer from this perspective.
Mhm. That's cool. I just searched it up. That's great. So back to what we were talking about. You did talk a little bit about culture, but you describe culture as evolving through variation, like you just talked about selection and transmission. But what are the best real-world examples of this process, and how can researchers measure selection or heritability in culture?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that. So, and
Mm,
I guess I'll provide some background before I try to answer your question. And so, of course, we know we're a cultural species. I mean,
mhm,
nobody can say no to that.
mhm,
And so much of what we do is due to our cultures, not our genes. And our cultures change, and so everybody's got to, in some sense, um, sign on to the idea uh, of uh, of human cultural evolution.
mhm,
But culture, because the study of evolution was centered so much on genes and genetic evolution, the study of cultural evolution was just neglected until about the 70s or 80s, and then it started to be studied more formally from an evolutionary perspective. In which case, now when we study cultural evolution, we ask the question, do cultures vary? And of course they do. And do those differences make a difference? Well, of course they do.
mhm,
And is there some kind of replication? The answer is yes. And that's why we're so adaptable. I mean, that's why just imagine a single species spreading all over the planet and occupying all those ecological niches. And so basically, cultural evolution is evolution in fast motion, in very fast motion. And we're now formalizing it a bit by um, by studying it more formally from an evolutionary perspective. And as evidence, now I'll point to one of my colleagues named Peter Turchin, who studies human history from an evolutionary perspective. And he has one of his books is titled War and Peace and War, and it's about the rise and fall of empires.
mhm,
And so what he shows is that empires tend to arise in geographical areas where there's chronic warfare. So cultures are just in constant war with each other. And an empire arises when one of those groups becomes very highly cooperative. So now we get cooperation, altruistic groups beating out selfish groups, often with the help of some new military technology. And then that empire spreads. I mean, that culture spreads, it becomes an empire. And then what happens almost immediately is that cultural evolution takes place within the empire for favoritism and various forms of factions form and things like that. And so the within group part begins to take place, and that accounts for the fall of the empires. And so it's within and between group selection taking place again and again and again. And
mhm,
then as another example, I'll point to the classical Greek period that people learn about in history classes. But
mhm,
what you have there is you have hundreds and hundreds of city-states
mhm,
like Athens and Sparta um, and they're all competing with each other.
mhm,
And so, and democracy, as it formulated in Athens, was once again a case where the the Athenian city-state became super highly cooperative by adopting this form of governance, this form of democracy, and that enabled them to outcompete their rival city-states in economic and military um, competition. So it turns out that the classical Greek period and the origin of democracy during that period is an example of uh, cultural evolution. And yes, warfare doesn't have everything to do with it, but it has a lot to do with it. So we don't want to have warfare now, and we don't need to have warfare, but historically, we need to appreciate that cultural evolution was in very large part a matter of military conflict.
Mhm. So through projects like the Evolution Institute and Pro-Social World, how have you applied these evolutionary principles to real organization, and how do you show that these approaches actually make groups more cooperative or fair or cohesive?
Yeah, well, that's the most exciting part of my work, or I should say, there's two exciting parts of my work. One is this big picture stuff where we can just understand everything from this perspective. So that's awesome. But
Mhm.
then to actually use it in real world settings. And I think you're going to ask me about Elinor Ostrom a little bit later on. So I'm going to introduce her now
Okay.
because she's really a pivotal figure.
Mhm.
And she was a political scientist, and what she studied groups that attempt to manage common pool resources like forests or fisheries or pastures. And those um, groups are vulnerable to something called the tragedy of the commons, which is basically what selfishness takes the form of is taking more than your share of the common resource. So if a bunch of people are grazing cows in a pasture, for example, and
Mhm.
one farmer adds cows to the pasture, then they're taking more than their share. And ultimately, if everybody does that, then the pasture becomes overgrazed. And
Mhm.
so the tragedy of the commons is something which is basically a manifestation of selfishness in the use of resources. And what Ostrom showed was that some groups are actually able to avoid that. They can self-manage their resources if they implement certain core design principles. And if you look at those principles, what you find is that they basically suppress the potential for cheating, basically. So
Mhm.
now, and they um, facilitate cooperation by suppressing um, uh, the potential for cheating. And let me just list them. I can do it quickly to make it a little bit more concrete.
Mhm.
And what I'm going to get to is that all groups need these core design principles. So when I talk about this and I have more time, I ask my audience, bring a group to mind. Think of a group that you know well, any kind of group that you know well, where people
Mhm.
are supposed to cooperate, and then see if these core design principles might be useful for that group that you know well. And so, um, first core design principle, a strong sense of identity and purpose. You have to know it's a group. It has to be a meaningful group. You need to know its boundaries, who's a member, what's it supposed to
Mhm.
do.
Mhm.
So that just defines the group and gives it meaning. Number two, benefits proportionate to cost, not sustainable for some members to do all the work and other members to get the benefits. Number
Mhm.
three, fair and inclusive decision making. Everybody should be involved in making the decisions for the group. If some people are calling the shots and others, well, you know that's not going to work and it's going to
Mhm.
be unfair and isn't going to make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group.
Mhm.
Number four, monitoring agreed upon behaviors. We need to know if we're doing what we're supposed to do. There has to be transparency as to whether we're doing what we agreed upon to do. Number five, graduated sanctions. Um, if you're not doing what you should, something has to be done about it. You don't
Mhm.
have to be mean. You can start out friendly. Hey brother, come on. But it must be also possible to escalate in some cases, and also we should be rewarding good behavior at the same time that we're correcting bad behavior. So there should be abundant praise for good behavior, mild punishment for bad behavior, which escalates when necessary. Number
Mhm.
six, conflict resolution needs to be fair and fast. Number seven, the group has to have the authority to self-govern, can't be bossed around by other groups. And number eight, appropriate relations with other groups that embody the same core design principles. So, sorry to go through it so fast, but here's my point. So, what she showed, without really describing it in evolutionary terms,
Mhm.
was a perfect example of how we can structure our groups to suppress disruptive self-serving behavior within the group so that the group becomes the unit of selection. And what I've been doing with many others is basically implementing those core design principles in schools. We could talk about schools, neighborhoods, businesses. That's how general they are. And so this is a priceless um, piece of knowledge that basically all groups need to be well governed and need
Mhm.
to know about these core design
Mhm.
principles.
Mhm. That's good. Um, so through the EVOS program and Evolution for Everyone, what have you found to be the most effective ways to teach non-biologists to think evolutionarily about human affairs? And how does that training change decisions in fields such as economics, education, and public administration?
So when I started to get passionate about this was about around 2000, and I'd been a professor for a long time,
Hmm.
and like many professors, interested primarily in research.
Hmm.
But after the generality dawned upon me, I really became passionate about teaching. And so the first thing I did was teach a course for non-majors called Evolution for Everyone.
Hmm.
And the second thing I did was to create a, a campus-wide multi-course program called Evolutionary Studies or EVOS. And what I discovered was that it's actually easy to teach this to anyone. That's why my course and book was titled Evolution for Everyone. As I think you can guess from this talk we're having, and our audience can guess, this is easy, this is intuitive and very powerful. So when I have a class for a whole semester, in the first, oh, 10 lectures, I can get across what this is, and then we can spend the rest of the semester applying it to topic after topic after topic.
Hmm.
And at the beginning, I was very careful to assess the course and to see how well it was doing. And I showed, I have publications that show that, yeah, this basically worked across the board. And the student evaluations, they were glowing. You'd get things like I just love this. I can't stop talking about it. I see everything through the lens of. So this is something that can be done very reliably
Hmm.
to any student and high school in addition to college. Just no reason why it can't be taught in high schools. And when it gets under your skin, because it is so explanatory, you just tend to use it. Like everyone uses a tool. If there's a useful tool, then people use it. And what this is, it's a set of useful conceptual tools. I actually describe it as a toolkit in Evolution for Everyone, and just about whenever I described it, that here's a conceptual toolkit. You can show up like a plumber or a carpenter and size up the job, pull out the tool, get the job done, move on to the next uh, topic. So that's how contagious it is, basically. And then I've been implementing that at my university and then through my nonprofits. The Evolution Institute and Pro Social World are my two nonprofits, and I've been basically um, trying to communicate this and put it into action for
Hmm.
now 25 years.
Hmm. Wow, that's
That's since before you were born.
that's great though. So given the historical misuse of evolutionary ideas in social contexts, how do you guard against deterministic or exclusionary interpretations when applying this cultural evolution to policy? And what governance ensures that pro-social aims don't slip into paternalism?
Right. So first of all, we have to talk a little bit more about history. There's something called social Darwinism, which is basically the moral justification of inequality and unbridled competition. It's like it's okay for it to be the survival of the fittest.
Hmm.
And an incorrect rendering of history is that first we got Darwin's theory, and then that became social Darwinism, and that was very dangerous, and so on and so forth. But it's much more complicated than that.
Hmm.
And I mean, Darwin's theory was so revolutionary that it was I mean, just all over the world, people were trying to make sense out of it. And some of them indeed became social Darwinism. So it's not as if that didn't exist. But
Hmm.
there were many other progressive thinkers who more or less took Darwinism in the direction of cooperation
Hmm.
and in social change. For many people, what Darwin's theory meant,
Hmm.
it meant that things changed because at that time, aristocratic society was said to be timeless. It was said to be ordained by God.
Hmm.
And so evolution all of a sudden said, no, the current social order didn't exist in the past and it need not exist in the future.
Hmm.
And so socialists grabbed on to um, Darwin in addition to the so-called social Darwinists. We have people in America, very progressive thinkers like John Dewey, who
Hmm.
was a great educational reformer and so on and so forth. So bottom line is anything that could be used as a tool can also be used as a weapon.
Hmm.
And that goes for Darwin's theory too. So Darwin's theory can be weaponized and has been,
Hmm.
um, but it's not any more vulnerable to that than any other theory. We need to be vigilant for all tools and that could be turned into weapons. And what really prevents that kind of abuse in modern times is because it says so clearly that what we need in this world is cooperation. And by no means is unbridled competition going to lead to any kind of good outcome. We can say that with authority. We need to cooperate.
Hmm.
And then what we can say, what evolution enables us to say, is that cooperation can evolve, but only if special conditions are met. If these special conditions are not met, then we will have unhelpful forms of competition. And so it's basically by focusing on the need for cooperation at all scales and identifying the conditions whereby cooperation can win the Darwinian contest. That's the form that modern evolution takes. And so it's very well protected,
Hmm.
basically, against harmful forms of competition.
Hmm. In what way specifically do you think this misuse occurs? Like, how do we weaponize and turn this from a tool into a weapon?
So nowadays, um, when people use the word social Darwinism, they're referring not to people that are invoking Darwin at all, but to people who are invoking competition as uh, uh, um, unambiguous good. Just let people compete, and then
Hmm.
things will turn out okay. And nowadays, that's basically what traditional economic theory
Hmm.
tells us. And so, when, for example, um, politicians call for unbridled competition, basically free market, it's sometimes called market fundamentalism,
Hmm.
then they're accused of being social Darwinists, even though they wouldn't dream of invoking Darwin. So that just goes to show you. But again, what's needed is to uh, refute that argument. The idea of the invisible hand, the idea that we could all pursue our our own interests. Individuals can pursue their interests, corporations can pursue their interests, and then they're led as if by an invisible hand to benefit the common good. It just ain't so.
Hmm.
It's just not so. And
Hmm.
so instead, we have to dot, 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 and then there's a whole prescription for what we need to um, for what we need to do.
Mhm. Many biologists argue that multi-level selection and inclusive fitness are the same. So, in practice, what tests or modeling choices help you decide when the multi-level framing adds predictive power or clarity over kin selection or gene-centered accounts?
Well, that's an advanced question. This is telling us that Keon has done quite a bit of reading on this topic,
Yeah.
and I'm uh, I'm wagering that almost everyone in the audience is going to say, "What are they talking about?" So, but I can give a little tutorial,
Yeah.
um, um, and uh, and so let's see, uh, let's see how I can do this best. So, kin selection in its simple form is just making the point that because genetic relatives share genes, then we could expect altruism among genetic relatives. So,
Mhm.
and it's even framed as a form of selfishness. So when I'm altruistic to you and you're my sister,
Mhm.
then I'm helping my genes in your body because since we both have the same parents,
Mhm.
then we share more genes than just random people in the population.
Mhm.
And so if I'm being selfish for my genes, then not only will I help myself, but I'll help you in proportion to our shared genes. So if you're my identical twin, I'll be extra nice to you. And if you're my mere sibling, I'll be half nice to you, my cousin, so on
Mhm.
and so forth. And so this was a theory that was advanced in the 1960s
Mhm.
and was called kin selection. And it results in a little nifty formula.
Mhm.
Um, and um, and for a while, it was thought to be an alternative to group selection. And then it was found to be, no, actually, it's different ways of describing the same thing. How can I explain that? I'm guess maybe I won't even try.
Okay.
I'll talk to Keon. I'll also just say,
Uh-huh.
but um, um, and one thing I think I will say is that a lot of these models when they were originated were based on very simple assumptions. So, for example, if we're interested in altruism and selfishness, then we build a model in which the altruistic behavior, there's a single locus, a single with two alleles. So
Mhm.
there's an altruistic one allele that codes for altruism, another allele codes for um, selfishness. So single gene, two alleles, and that gives us our true behaviors. So as simple as the translation from the behavioral level to the genetic level is made as simple as it could possibly be.
Mhm.
And it turns out that that's really misleading because the actual interactions, the relationship between how you behave as an individual and your genetic basis, not to speak of your cultural basis, is much, much more complex than that. And that complexity actually makes a difference.
Mhm.
And when you include more complex models, it's at that point that group selection or multi-level selection becomes the only choice. It's not a matter of equivalence. Kin selection and the math behind it breaks down. But this is something that I think is like um, you know evolution 301 or 501, not evolution 101. So I think
Mhm.
that's probably as much as we need to say about that.
Yeah, it's no problem. Thank you for your explanations. They're good. They're very like they're I can tell that you're explaining such a difficult thing in such simple words for us.
Do my best. I do my best.
Yes. So if we use cultural evolution as a tool, how would we apply it to address big challenges like climate change, inequality, or political division? And what kind of institutions do you think we would need to make cooperation work on these larger scales?
For that, these are giant questions. So they, hold on a minute. So they defy simple answers. But what I'll say is what needs to be done for any problem, any big problem, is operating at a number of levels. And in the first place, we have to operate at the global level, you might say. So we must have the whole system in mind, ultimately the whole earth. So in terms of identities, when people ask me, who am I like to say, first and foremost, I'm a human being and citizen of the earth. Okay.
Mhm.
So there's some sense in which when we act, we have to we have to be responsible for the consequences of our actions. And if something we do is harmful at some larger scale, we can't let that stand. And we can't let other people doing that stand as well. So we always need to be considering the actions of the consequences of our actions. And they don't always percolate up to the global scale, thankfully, but
Mhm.
often they do. And so basically, we have to have a whole earth ethic. That's the macro. But at the same time, we need just the opposite. We need, as individuals, not to be standalone individuals,
Mhm.
but to be individuals who exist in these small, meaningful, and appropriately structured groups that I described, these Elinor Ostrom
Mhm.
groups. That's the optimal human social environment. So if you really want to get something done, then that's far beyond what you can do as an individual, then form a small group and structure that group more or less as described. It's going to be so fulfilling for you. And that group is going to be much more efficacious than if if you try to act alone. So there's macro and micro, but there's also meso, everything in the middle.
Mhm.
And for there we have so much our institutions and governments and our many social identities, our religious identities, our political, ethnic identities, and so on and so forth. And when you ask, what's a social identity? When you say, I'm a Catholic or I'm a Republican or I'm a Texan or what that's doing, it's actually like a set of cultural instructions for how to behave in a certain context. Isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
Your identity is basically instructions for how to behave as a Texan, as a Republican, or so on and so on and so forth. And those identities um, don't go away, but they need to be coordinated
Mhm.
so with the higher good in mind. And so it's a huge coordination problem, basically. Macro, micro, and meso, all of which more or less requires a lot of intentionality. And as to where you can change a system, it depends very much on, so every situation is malleable in some respects, but not in others. So some things that you're not going to change soon,
Mhm.
they become obstacles that you have to work around. Other things you can change. And so you have to be very flexible, basically. Flexibility and adaptability is an important part of this. Um, and in order to know in this multi-level system, uh, what can we change over the short term? And fortunately, that smallest scale, the kind of groups that we form around ourselves, that's the easiest scale.
Mhm.
And so that's really hopeful that we can increase the quality of our life, just like that,
Mhm.
just by, first of all, gaining this knowledge and then putting it to use in all the spheres of our life where we have some control. And we have a lot of control about who we associate with and what we do and how they're structured and
Mhm.
so on. So there's a big bottom-up component
Mhm.
that is very hopeful and exciting to bring about.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. And so at the end of our interviews, we ask the same two questions to everyone. It's the first one is, how do you define success? And then what advice would you have for like our younger generation?
So I think the key word pro-social means that when I'm pro-social, I have the interest of not just myself in mind, but my
Mhm.
group, my system, so on.
Mhm.
And so for me, success is to cause systemic change, which is beneficial for everyone and it does
Mhm.
not do harm. So I'm not out for myself, or if you're
Mhm.
pro-social, you're not out for yourself.
Mhm.
If you're really pro-social, you're not even out for your group because your group has to be pro-social too. It has to be pro-social all the way to the top. So to be pro-social and to implement pro-sociality, that's what I mean by success.
Mhm.
And as for the current generation, um, there's so much about the anxious generation and social media, and you might be familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work on called the anxious generation,
Mhm.
and then people like to name the different generations as if they're like super different from each other. But I don't, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think we're all human beings
Mhm.
and citizens of the world, but I think that I would just think this is the very best time to learn about this and apply it. And I'll actually end with a story that I was at a conference, and it was like a social activism conference.
Mhm.
And the person stood up and said, "How many of you became social activists after college?" And
Mhm.
almost no one raised their hand. And
Mhm.
then, and then he said, "How many people of you became social activists during college?"
Mhm.
Still only a few people raised their hand.
Mhm.
And then he said, "How many of you became social activists in high school?"
Mhm.
And that's when everyone raised their hand.
Mhm.
And so it does begin early.
Mhm.
And I think so. This is the ideal time of life to gain this knowledge and
Mhm.
then use it in charting your future course.
Mhm.
And there's so much resources to draw upon, basically,
Mhm.
that and I would hope that Kian and others would. This is something that Pro Social World attempts to do for all ages. So I mean, so if any group of younger people wanted to get involved, wanted to learn this stuff and all of that, we're here to help. So
Mhm.
so see us.
Mhm. Yes, there's so many people that are willing to really like help us and guide us to what we want to learn about. So it's great.
Yeah, but agency, I mean, in a sense, you have to call the shots.
Right.
And so this is another point. These groups, these optimal um, groups, they're very participatory. They require the group members
Mhm.
to take part. They're like miniature democracies,
Mhm.
and so this is another hopeful thing that as this becomes more common and more commonly practiced, it's really firming up the soil basically for
Mhm.
democratic governance, and so
Mhm.
that's another hopeful thing about it.